Hello everybody and welcome to today's lesson. My name is Brentan and today I'm excited to open up a little chat about the shoulder joint. And we can look at how it's made, how it's built, what it's designed to do, all of that good stuff, with the intention, of course, to have there be a little bit more clarity when we're looking at our movement and we're assessing our own movement, so that movement can start to feel more fun, it can start to feel more second nature, more instinctual, and more intelligent as well. So let's dive right in. The shoulder is the ball and socket joint created by the upper arm, which is called the humerus, right into the side of the shoulder blade on the back, which is called the scapula. And so there's actually three bones that come together to form what's called the shoulder girdle. There's all these different terminologies, and all these different bones actually have different ways of moving, which I guess contributes to the fact that for me, shoulders have been just kind of a very blurry, confusing subject and thing to pay attention to. And that's why I'm excited to chat a little bit more and see if we can kind of clear up some of the fog around the shoulders today. So we have the humerus, we have the scapula on the back, we also have the clavicle on the front, the collarbone right over here. So before we get into movement or the muscles that create that movement, let's talk a little bit about the structure of the joint itself. So the structure of the whole shebang is called the shoulder girdle. So when you hear people refer to shoulder girdle, you're hearing them refer to the relationship between those three bones. So now the collarbone you can feel, like right here, it's like the inner edge of both of the collarbones. And so then they travel outward and they form like a shelf right up here, where actually they cross over and they attach right on top of the acromion process on the scapula. You can feel that it's like there's like a little bony protrusion like right at the top. You feel your shoulder and it's all bony, but then there's one part that's really kind of pointy bony. Okay, so that's where those two bones meet, where the collarbone meets the scapula. And so there's very, very little movement there, maybe none at all. And if you were to have a separation there, they might call that, a separated shoulder. So when we're talking about movement of the shoulder, those two joints where they come together, pretty solid. No, so we know where the clavicle ends on this side and how it attaches, right? But then on the inner side, it comes to the sternum. So that's the up and down kind of breastbone in the body. Sometimes I think about it as like the front spine, like we have the spine on the back, the spine on the front, and then the ribs come and they attach onto it. So what's interesting about that is that right here, this is actually the only part of the shoulder girdle that attaches to what's called our axial skeleton. And the axial skeleton is the pelvis and the spine and the rib cage. So sort of like the center, most crucial part of the body, and everything else is called the appendicular skeleton. So, while the hips are, the pelvis is part of that axial skeleton, the only part of the shoulder that's part of the axial skeleton is right where it attaches here on the front. And that kind of lets it have this big range of movement, like our hips are built more for stability, limited range of motion. Our shoulders are built more for mobility, bigger range of motion. And so how the bones are structured and how they fit together all impacts that, right? So that's where we have the clavicle. Now, then we have the head of the arm bone, the humerus that sits right in the socket here. And then on the back, we have an upside down triangular bone called the scapula. And so I don't know, maybe you can kind of see a little bit of movement, this is, where is it? If I do this, you can get a little bit more. It's right here is where it's poking out for me. So the upside down bone back here, that is the scapula, it provides the socket portion of the joint. So that's why we refer to the shoulder as the ball and socket joint. So the little on the side of the of the scapula. There's a really shallow groove. It's a much shallower groove than the hip, where like the hip, you just like plug the thigh bone right in and it just like fits nice and snug in there. Shoulder's a little bit different, much more shallow. Again, contributes to that really wide range of motion. So now we know about our 3 bones. We know that the only place that they attach to the axial skeleton is right here at the collarbones. That means that otherwise, they're independent of the ribs. They're independent of the spine. And we'll see when we go to do our mobility work in the next series of classes, we'll get to see how to sort of empower that part of the back to reclaim its independence, to do things on its own where the spine and the ribs don't feel like they have to be so involved. So that gets into sort of the overall structure of the joint. Then we can talk about movements. And movements, it's not as simple as the hips where we're like, we just have these 6 really crystal clear movements. Now we do have the same 6 joint positions or joint movements of the shoulder, but because there's these 3 bones involved, they all have different movement potential. So let's just get into like colloquially what we call the shoulder, or when you hear people talk about shoulder movement, or, you know, it's sort of like, that was a very blurry word for me for a long time because I was like, what are you referring to? Like this ledge right here? Like when I first came to yoga, that's what I imagined a shoulder was just, that's the only information I had was like, oh, it's the ledge. I didn't know what it was. So when people are talking about shoulder movement, what they're most likely referring to is movement of the arm in the socket. And so we can call that shoulder movement. You can call that movement of the humerus. But for all intents and purposes, if you hear someone out there saying, move your shoulder like this, they're probably referring to moving your arm bone in a particular direction. So just like our hips were designed for 6 different joint positions, our shoulders are designed for the exact same ones. So the shoulder is able to flex. That's as the arm moves forward in front and all the way up to the sky. And it's any range of that motion. So you could say like flex your shoulder at 90 degrees, and that might be something like this, which would be more like a plank pose or like a tabletop position or something like that. And it can, you know, then you work on flexion all the way up. Now, just a quick note, we're going to get to this in our mobility sequence, but flexion means that the arm lifts up without the ribs or the spine or the pelvis feeling like they need to shift or accommodate. So that's what most of our mobility practice is going to look like. Now, at the same end, like if you just say that this is anatomical neutral for the shoulder with the arm down by the side, if flexion was in front, you know, if we look at flexion as the movement that happens in front, then what would we say extension would be? Would be the opposite of that, would be moving towards the back. So flexion extension as joint movements are coupled, so they're like the opposites. Like you're either flexing or you're extending. Or you could say like here you're in a flex position, and if you were to say, well, move your shoulder into extension, okay, boom, boom, back like that. So that takes care of 2. Then we have rotation, same as the hips. We have internal, which is this way, external, which is this way. An interesting note about the rotation, you know, you've probably heard of the rotator cuff. That's like a group of 4 muscles on the back that are responsible for moving the shoulder blade and externally rotating the arm. So our external rotators, we have less of them than internal rotators. The internal rotators, even this big pec muscle in the front, you know, it squeezes, gets smaller, and it pulls the head of the arm forward. That's a big muscle. It's very strong. Plus, on top of that, most of us are probably rehearsing internal rotation of the shoulder most of the day just by our lifestyle. So when we're talking about shoulder external rotation, that's really a big limitation for most people, but it shows up in pretty much all of our weight-bearing postures on the arms. Even like chaturanga would be like, the push-up position would be, how can I keep my shoulder externally rotated here to the best of my ability, but take my arm into chaturanga arm here. And so you'll maybe even notice from your own practice, like what's your tendency, for example, of the shoulder rolling forward in the socket in something like a push-up, a chaturanga, things like that. So it's worthwhile to get to know the shoulder for these types of reasons. Now, your arm can rotate, it can rotate in the flexed position, it can rotate in the extended position. So rotation can be coupled. It can rotate in the abducted position, which is arms out to the side, right? And then it can rotate in the adducted position with the arm in. So that gets into our 6 different movements. There's sort of like 3 categories, like flexion extension, it's either or. Rotation, that's either or, internal or external. And then there's abduction and adduction, and that's either or. But with those either ors, you can combine any one from all 3 categories. So for example, you could have your arm flexed, you could have the arm flexed and abducted and internally rotated, right? So like maybe it would be more like that. So you can kind of see where we're going with that, right? Okay, so that's shoulder movements. We're gonna work on that a lot. But our collarbone can also move, and it also has 6 movements, although they have a little different name. So we can think about like the movement of the collarbone and the movement of the scapula on the back. They're sort of like the sandwich is of the shoulder, right? The collarbone gives support from the front, the shoulder blade from the back. And so they have the same movements as each other. They can sort of mirror each other, but you can even feel this with me if you'd like. So the collarbones they can retract, which means they can draw toward each other. And you can retract your collarbones if you just kind of cave your chest in a little bit and draw your chin in, and you can actually feel the bones moving toward each other. And then if you keep your hands there, you can feel them protract in the opposite direction if you sort of open your chest more like you were going towards a back bend. And so you can just kind of go back and forth like a little cat-cow and see if you can sort of start to sense the collarbones moving together and away from each other. Now, in addition to that, which the shoulder blades can also do, they can rotate. And so your collarbone can rotate forward. If you take your hand to one collarbone and you sort of reach the other arm behind, you internally rotate it, reach it behind, you can feel the bone actually spin down. And so same thing, if you bring the arm up, you can feel it spin up. And so if you do this a couple of times, you can just start to feel like, okay, when my arm moves forward and backward, what does my collarbone like to do? And it's just getting us a little bit more acquainted with that whole area. Now, the last thing that it can do, besides move together away, rotate forward and backward, would be to elevate and depress. You can do that just by shrugging your shoulders, and you can see how like, okay, well, these bones are all, the collarbone's connected to the shoulder blade's connected to the arm bone. So by its nature, when I move one of these bones, the other pieces are going to want to move with it to some degree. Now we can go to the scapula on the back, the shoulder blades on the back, which become a much bigger piece of the conversation when we start looking at yoga and we start looking at weight-bearing postures on the hands and on the arms. So with the scapula back here, again, they can retract, which is they can move together, and they can protract, they can move apart. And now here's something interesting. I'm just going to do this a couple of times. And I'm really new to this, so it's like my brain's still mapping out all this area and still figuring out how to be more specific, more nuanced with its movement. But you'll see that like moving your shoulder blades, like squeezing them together as if you wanted to like squeeze like a pencil or a pen in there or something. It's easy when the shoulders externally rotate right here. Like the arms roll open and then the shoulder blades move together on the back. And conversely, if you roll the arms forward, the shoulder blades will move away from each other. So what this means is the arms are a lever of the shoulder. So when the arms move, it wants to move the other bones with it, right? So it makes sense that there's rotational elements that the arm can take that make the shoulder blade on the back want to do things. But there's a difference between the arms sort of initiating the movement and sort of the arms manipulating the shoulder blades to make the shoulder blades go away and squeeze together, versus the arms trying to stay as much out of that as possible, and instead the muscles of the upper back and here working to grab the shoulder blades together and draw the shoulder blades apart. That was a really big key for me. I was practicing yoga every day for 8 years, and I never even thought about it. So, but it's game changing, because we want the upper back to be able to manipulate the shoulder blades. The way that the muscles are in the upper back, which now I think is as good as enough time to talk about it as anything, but there's lots of different layers of them. There's so many different muscles that, there's one that goes down from the neck to the shoulder blade. There's ones that go around the ribs and they go, muscles, the serratus muscles, they're like fingers in between the ribs, and they go back and they actually go underneath the shoulder blade and attach to it from the back. So you have a muscle in between your shoulder blade and your rib cage that's capable of moving and manipulating the shoulder blade from underneath. I mean, it's crazy. But if we don't train these muscles to do that work, they're never gonna know. So we need to almost this is why mobility is important. It brings these areas back online where the brain knows how to actually contract and recruit activation in these areas, which it doesn't know how to do unless we practice it. So, we have 16 different muscles that act on the shoulder blades. That's crazy. So better to teach those muscles up in the upper back how to manipulate, move the shoulder blades around, rather than just depending on the arms to sort of rotate and kind of pull the shoulder blades or push the shoulder blades into a protracted or retracted position. So that takes care of protraction, retraction. Now, just like the collarbone in front, our shoulder blades can elevate and depress. You can see if you just take your arms overhead, that it'll swing the shoulder blades up with you. We like that. But you could play with elevation and depression here. I don't know if you could see this, but just trying to lift the shoulder blades up and down. And again, to try and get that to happen with muscles surrounding the shoulders, rather than pulling with the arms and then just kind of letting the shoulder blades come along for a ride. Why not strengthen them, strengthen their independence from the back by recruiting strength in those back muscles? So we have elevation and depression, and we also have rotation. Yeah, so not only do the scapula, I think what I was just showing is actually there's some rotational element when the arms go overhead versus when they go down. And you can kind of feel that on your back, the triangles. If you imagine you had triangles on your back, when they go up, they spin with the arms, right? So we'll get into all of these scapular movements in actually a class that's just for shoulder blade mobility, because it's that important that we want to say, hey, yes, I want to teach my arm how to do its 6 shoulder movements, but I also want to teach my scapula how to do their 6 movements as well. I think the collarbones are a little bit less, they're more going along for the ride, so to speak. But there's always ways that we can, fill in the blanks and the gaps there as well. So I think I'm going to leave our conversation there, because if we try to go into this muscle does this, suffice it to say we have muscles that go all the way around. A lot of them are laid diagonally so that we have more power in this type of thing, right? We have muscles on the arms. Think of your shoulders as really this entire upper hemisphere of the body, recruiting things in the chest, in the sides of your armpits, and your back, and your arms. And then I think that might be more useful than trying to pinpoint all of the various different muscles and figure out what they do. All of our muscles do all joint positions. Even muscles in my feet are doing something when the shoulders are flexed. So I hope that this information is useful to you, and it kind of helps explain some things that are going on, and maybe gives you like a new rubric or baseline to kind of judge your movement experience and assess your movement experience too. So thank you so much for your time and your attention today. If you'd like to donate to this work, I'd love to see you over on our Patreon. And also I'll put a link to the description down below. And I look forward to practicing some shoulder movements with you over the next several weeks. So thank you again, everybody. See you next time.